Hey guys, Tammy here. And in this video, we're going to talk about, should you withhold information? Should you be sharing more information? How much do you share? How much do you withhold? When to share it? How to share it? All that kind of thing. Depending on the situation, this can be a little bit confusing. I'm going to try to give you a few parameters to kind of help you decipher. And I will tell you the number one place you always start with this kind of question. So before we get into that, if you like this content, then please hit like on the video and also subscribe to the channel so that you get notified as new videos are released. And also please share on social media to help other people going through this kind of thing. When we are dealing with a co-parent, it's really hard when you're dealing with somebody who is high conflict or is narcissistic, because you know that every single bit of information that you give them, they are going to use to manipulate, right? Or use against you or twist it or whatever it is that they can do with it. So I think a lot of times we try to withhold as much information as we can because we just don't want to go through the stress of that. Now, where you should always start with this is, what is your court order? Okay, is there a court order around this specific issue? For instance, I had a friend move recently and she said, well, when do I have to notify the other parent of the new address? And I said, I don't know. What does your court order say? And she's like, I don't know. And I'm like, well, probably a good place to start. Let's look and see if there's a parameter in there. And usually if you move or have a change of address, there usually is a clause that you notify the other parent within 24 hours or whatever of the move, because typically you want to know where your kids are sleeping. The other parent has a right to know where their kids are sleeping and all that kind of thing. So typically you'll have like a 24-hour, notice that'll have to happen. But it's usually within 24 hours of the change of address. So you don't necessarily have to tell them months or weeks in advance, especially if you have concerns that they would try to, if you're, moving into a situation where you're renting a room from somebody inside another house, or you're doing, probably you're not doing a lot of that kind of thing if you're in a custody situation. But if you are, it's kind of like you may have fear that they're going to try to contact that person or find out about them. I know this is a lot of concern when I'm dealing with people that were married to either military people or, sometimes firemen, police officers, people that are kind of in that civil service kind of sector. A lot of times I find that ex-spouses of those kinds of people will be fearful of them trying to reach out and do something or cause a problem for them, or, that kind of thing. So you do have to follow your orders in regards to sharing information. You can't just move and not tell them or whatever. So you want to check your orders first to find out. So, usually things like if you want to travel, you've got to give notice, right? And there's usually parameters, again, set forth for that, 7 days, 14 days, whatever it is your orders say. Usually neither parent is allowed to withdraw them from school without consent of both parties and things like that. But I think those things are a little bit easier to figure out. They're a little more cut and dry because they're the big things, right? The stuff that kind of gets us is the day-to-day things. And I think one of the struggles that I see parents deal with over and over is a lot of us have had really tight relationships with our children. Although you have certain things you don't share with your children that are, more of adult type issues. I think a lot of us do, our children are included in our life, in our world, right? So they are involved a lot and can hear a lot of things. And I think a lot of times kids are just running around doing their thing and we don't even realize how much they're absorbing or hearing or whatever. But when you're in a co-parenting situation like this, you have to be a little more alert to that kind of issue. Because what I tell people is, look, anything that you say in the presence of your child, you need to essentially assume that it's going back to the other parent, especially if your child's between the ages of 6 and 10. They're like parrots. They almost always will go back and say whatever it was they heard you say. I always say, like, it's unfortunate, but you essentially have to be in the presence of that child, filtering yourself to the point where you're not saying or talking about anything that you wouldn't want the other parent to know. You know, you have to kind of behave as if there were a recorder in the room with you at all times, for the other parent, essentially. It's tough. It's tough to draw that boundary, but I will tell you, one of the things that happens if you don't is your kids feel more stress, because then what happens is, you know, they go back and forth between the homes. Sometimes they're grilled by one parent or the other, or sometimes they say something and then that parent reacts and then they realize, oh, maybe I shouldn't have said anything about that. Or then they get questioned about it. And so it just ends up putting them in the middle on all of these different topics. And honestly, kids most of the time are just trying to have their time in each world and not get in trouble and not upset anybody. And they're just trying to survive essentially themselves. And the situation's tough for them. They're being tossed back and forth, you know, a lot of times every couple days or so. And they don't always recognize when they're being asked something that, like, oh, that's not an appropriate thing for that parent to be asking you, right? They don't know that. And then if you have said something in front of them, or worse yet, you've told them something and told them not to say anything about it, then that just puts them squarely in the middle, because now I'm going to go into a situation where I'm being asked about things by the other parent, or I'm being grilled, but I've been told not to say anything. Now I have to try to bear up under that, even though I do have the information. Right. And so that just creates a really stressful situation for them, where they're having to choose their loyalty. Right. It's essentially putting them in the middle, and they're having to choose, okay, do I keep this information to myself like parent A asked me to, or do I reveal to parent B what's going on now that they're asking me questions about it? So it's just better all the way around not to put your children in those situations, and just to know that no matter what you talk about in front of the children, you have to expect that that is going to be repeated to your ex. I mean, it may not be. You may get lucky and it may not be, or it may not happen a few times or whatever. But I would say more times than not, the one thing that you didn't want repeated is the one thing that they come back and say. I remember when Thomas's oldest son was 5, his mother was homeschooling him. And so he was gone with her during the day while we were working. And I believe that day she had said, you know, I have some appointments. I'll be out running around in the afternoon. Do you want me to just drop him off to you? Because I used to we'd go pick him up. And I said, yeah, sure, that's fine. So the child comes home as she drops him off. And I should probably tell you that Thomas and his ex-wife were infertile, and they adopted the 2 boys. And so when she got pregnant with her first daughter, that was really an emotionally difficult thing for Thomas. She got pregnant with her first daughter with her second husband, her husband after Thomas. So it was a little bit of an emotional thing for Thomas, right? Because they had tried really hard and done IVF and all these things. And then they had a second child. Anyway, the 4-year-old or 5-year-old comes in, and he walks straight into the living room, walks straight over to Thomas's chair, looks him dead in the eye, and said, "There's a baby in mommy's belly, but she told me not to tell you." And she was pregnant with the second daughter at the time. And, you know, so many parents would have just been like, really? Well, how do you know there's a baby in her belly? Well, you know, did she go to the doctor? Well, you know, is it a boy or a girl? Or, you know, whatever her questions would have been, most people would have started asking questions. And Thomas just very calmly looked at him and he said, if your mother asked you not to tell me that, then why are you telling me? And the child was kind of like, he's 5. He didn't really have an answer for that, right? So that's an example of kind of 2 pieces of this, which is that mom should not have told him if she wasn't prepared for him to share that information with us. She should have never put him in that position where he was going to have to decide whether to keep her secret or whether to blab it. And apparently he made the decision very, very quickly that he was going to blab it. But it also put Thomas in a position where he then had to make sure that he drew the boundary and didn't overstep. I always say if the kid opens the window, it's your job to close it. And I think that's kind of what that is. But also it put the child in the situation where, one, it was, like I said, he was put in the middle where he's like deciding, do I say something? Do I not say something? But then once he did say something, and then he kind of saw Thomas's reaction to it, which luckily was about as minimal as somebody could have done, I think. But he obviously kind of knew that Thomas wasn't thrilled with him telling that information. And so then he was kind of like, oh, I did something wrong. I did something I shouldn't have done, right? There's just multiple components to it where you shouldn't share that information. That's something very, very personal, right? Like a pregnancy in particular is very personal, and you're not obligated to share that with your ex-spouse. And so I would say if there's something along those lines that you don't want them to know, then you don't share it with the child. Sometimes we have illnesses or diagnoses or whatever that we don't necessarily want the other person to know. Well, guess what? You better not share that with the children either, because as soon as you do, they're going to regurgitate it, or they're going to be stuck in the middle trying to figure out how to deal with it. But at the same time, you can't withhold important things. You can't withhold things related to where you live. You can't withhold things related to the child specifically or around school or different things of that nature. But you should withhold things that are of a personal nature to you that really don't involve the child, really. I mean, obviously a pregnancy is eventually going to involve the child because eventually they're going to have a sibling, right? Eventually it's going to come around and it's going to involve them. But in the first instance, I think she was only about 3 or 4 months along when she shared that information. And obviously she didn't need to share it with the child at that point. What she probably should have done was to let Thomas know herself first before she shared it with the child, so that information would have been coming from her and not from the child. Then the child says something, then, Thomas wouldn't have been having the reaction that he had in front of the child. So again, like many, many things in this situation, there's a lot of discernment that goes into these decisions. And these are the types of things that can cause you problems in the court or cause problems with the child. And so you have to be really discerning on what does get shared, what doesn't get shared, and there's a balance to it. And again, I'd love to just give you a list of here's all the things you share, here's all the things you don't. But I would say if I was going to give you any specific guidance, I would start with check your orders. Make sure you always know what your requirement is around anything like this, and don't share anything you don't want the other parent to know, okay? That they don't need to know. If they don't need to know and you don't want them to know, don't share it. It's as simple as that. If you'd like to get help with this or any other issue in your custody case, you can go to divorceuniversityonline.com/VIP-coaching. There's a link on that page where you can book a time to speak to a member of my staff, learn more about my services, and how I might be able to support you on this journey. See you guys next time. Thanks for watching.
We'll grow in number, fueled by the